We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, I'm going to be talking about some recent watch releases. And no, unfortunately, there are not any Rolex watches on the list, but I think there's a couple of watches that at least I find particularly interesting. And there is a little bit of a mixture between some expensive watches and at least one affordable watch as well. So a little bit of something for everyone. On the wrist today, I have an Anacar. This is my Anacar Sherpa Guide. Love this watch. Very cool. Anacar is a brand that I personally have loved for at least the last decade, and I think there's a lot of room for this brand to grow, even though the original brand certainly does not exist. I think there's kind of an offshoot or like a revitalized version of the Anacar brand out there, but it's certainly not even close to the same as what I'm wearing here today. Also, guys, please do not forget to check out delraywatch.com, where we're actually having a bit of a deal for those that are the diamond hands holding the GME stock, if you know what I mean. Check it out, delraywatch.com. The first watch that was just released actually today is an Omega Seamaster 300, specifically limited edition for the Beijing Winter Olympics 2021. Now, it's kind of interesting because this watch is almost the same as the somewhat recently released Omega Seamaster 300 Nekton watch, which is named after kind of an underwater diving apparatus that does some underwater research that Omega kind of partners with and puts their logo on, and perhaps even donates to the kind of the organization that runs that. But this specific Winter Olympics Seamaster 300 with titanium bezel, I absolutely love. I think the dial has a very unique color and shine to it. Now I'm looking at pictures, of course. I've not held the watch yet because it was just announced within either today or yesterday, I believe, depending on where you are in the world. But I'm really looking forward to this particular watch because it goes to show that Omega is willing to kind of try different things. Now, they've always done the Olympic partnerships in the past, but it shows that they're also willing to take that step and put the titanium bezel on and make little iterative changes to their classic line, being the Seamaster 300. And as watch geeks and collectors, I think sometimes that's really what makes us tick, right? The little special nuances of why you bought one version of a watch instead of another. But when you look at the Omega Seamaster 300s of yesteryears, they, getting into the Bond era, they didn't really have too many variations. Now they have more. Some people don't enjoy that because they think it's kind of a gimmick, kind of a catch, but I think it's unique and interesting, and it allows people to get into watches and still retain their sense of originality, right? Because when you buy a Rolex, a modern contemporary Rolex, you're buying a modern contemporary Rolex without any kind of unique individuality that comes behind it, right? You can't necessarily buy different bezel variations and things like that like you used to be able to, or at least like you can with other brands. So I think Omega does something really special with that. And at $6,400 US dollars for the retail price, I do think that you should probably try to get a deal on this, probably try to get a discount. I don't know if this is going to be as desirable as some of the Omega Seamaster 300s, but at least if you can get a discount on that and you care about the long-term value retention, I don't think you're hurting yourself at all if you like the watch. Next, we have a Piaget Polo Skeleton 42 millimeters. I also really enjoy this particular watch. Now, what's great about this watch, now we'll talk about certain aspects of it in one second, but what I think is the best feature of this Piaget Polo is that it is such a thin watch. It's about half of the thickness of a Rolex Submariner. Now, I'm kind of referring to the last iteration of the Rolex Submariner ceramic bezel, but it's about half, give or take, than that watch. So it's a very thin watch, a thin sports watch. Now, it's 42 millimeters at 6.5 millimeters thick, so you do get a little bit more of a wrist presence without kind of giving up that under the cuff ability that some watches kind of do when they get to be larger, right? Like when you look at the 42 millimeter Omega Seamaster Beijing, it's going to wear a little bit larger on the wrist than something like this Piaget, and it might be difficult to wear that like under a cuff or with a blazer or something like that. But when you look at this Piaget Polo, because it's so thin, I think the movement is only something like 2.7 or 3 millimeters thick, depending on how it's measured. So the movement alone is just so thin. And some people really enjoy that kind of little feature of a watch that makes it special, that being so thin, kind of a talking piece or a talking point that you can kind of talk about. Now, I will say that, by the way, they have a blue dial, but also since the dial is essentially the movement because it's skeletonized, the movement is blued. And when you look at this one on the images, at least because this watch was just released, I haven't had the time or honestly the ability to see this one in the flesh. When you look at the movement, it is absolutely beautiful to see that kind of blued skeletonized movement, in-house Piaget movement, really beautiful there. But I will say that kind of the caveat with this watch, and also the skeleton watches from some of the other more prestigious manufacturers, those that have a skeleton watch, AP, even a Girard-Perregaux Laureato, some of the Vacherons of the past. When you look at those skeleton watches, they have high retail prices, and so does this Piaget Polo at $28,000 US. Yes, a bit of a steep price for a sports watch, though it has that unique movement, very thin watch, and for some people, they're willing to pay the price tag. That being said, once again, another brand that you're going to want to score a little bit of discount if you can find the watch, and you have to have that watch. There are some alternatives out there like the GP Laureato, which you can find their skeleton watch kind of floating around sometimes at $15,000 for Laureato, and this is a similar kind of watch, sports watch, Genta or Genta inspired. But nonetheless, very cool watch, and I think Piaget is at least trying to capture the minds, hearts, and attentions of us as watch collectors. Next, we have a very limited release by Bremont, or Bremont, depending on how you'd like to pronounce it. Now, this watch is the Bremont Limited Edition Rugby Football Union 150 chronometer GMT in 43 millimeters. Now, a bit of a mouthful. But I do think this watch kind of serves an interesting purpose, or maybe an appropriate purpose for someone that likes rugby, because it does feature rugby time indicators on the bezel. Now, I'll say I don't watch rugby, so personally this doesn't appeal a lot to me, though if there's any rugby fans out there, please leave in the comments below if this perhaps is something that you'd love to put in your collection. I don't know how many rugby watches there are out there, with the exception of Bremont, who also has, I believe, at least done rugby partnerships in the past, but I can see that it really shows another brand, Bremont, that's trying to once again capture the attention of watch collectors and not so much the casual buyer, because they are introducing little things that might help people associate themselves with the brand, much like Omega does with the Olympics and the Necton and things like that. It kind of shows that the brands are starting to carve out little pieces of the watch collecting community depending on your interests. So Bremont, I don't know if I would say necessarily keep this watch on your radar, but I do think it's a very handsome and attractive watch, but at a price tag of $5,400 US retail, par for the course. But I will say that based on the Bremont watches we've traded here at DelReyWatch.com, that unfortunately they are a bit of a tough sell. So something to keep in mind if you care about that thing. But if you watch the channel, then you know I don't always or almost never recommend watches being investments, and always buy what you enjoy. Lastly, a bit of an affordable option. We have a Bulova Oceanographer, and it's a vintage-inspired 1970s Devil Diver. Now, what this means is when you notice on the dial, it's labeled 666 feet instead of meters, and that's kind of given it the Devil Diver's name out there. And I think it's kind of cool watch design. Now, particularly Bulova has been guilty recently of coming out with a lot of vintage inspired watches, but I think when you're a brand that kind of plays in that space, just anything you can do to kind of revitalize the brand and bring it more to the center and gain attention is probably something you need to do, because when you think of all the watch options that are out there, what's going to differentiate a more affordable brand from another if it's not for the brand recognition? While the brand Bulova is recognizable, it doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot when people in that kind of realm have been gravitating towards Seiko, which has been knocking it out of the park in terms of quality and cool watch designs for this price point once again. So when Bulova comes out with another vintage inspired watch, I can't knock them too much for doing so. I might be able to knock or, hold it against a brand that's also coming out with $10,000, $15,000 watches. That could be something that I can see myself doing as finding it to be a bit of a cheap way out in terms of design. But I think when we're talking about a price tag of $750, and I'm sure these watches will be gray market for maybe half that price, I can't really hold it against them. And it features a Miyota movement, so it is going to be rugged, durable, workhorse watch. And if you like that vintage design and, maybe even the orange dial for something a little bit more eccentric, I don't think that I could not recommend that. It wouldn't be at the top of my list to recommend at this price point, because at this price point, I think you can get into some decent entry-level vintage watches, which hold a lot of horological respect among collectors, but also I think you could probably get into Seiko and some other watches as well. So something to keep on the radar. What will Bulova do next? Who knows? Time will only tell. So what do you guys think? Are there any other recently released watches out there that are on your radar or that you've heard about? I would love to see it in the comments below. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.